Did you know that the New York Times avoided reporting about the Holocaust during the war? This entity, known as the Paper of Record, lied to the world about Stalin's brutality, the effects of the bomb on Japan, and more recently, COVID's origin. Has the New York Times ever been objective or honest? Ashley Rindsberg illustrates in this conversation that the answer is no. So why do so many Americans still trust this gray lady? I want to start by saluting you for your courage, and the listeners are about to realize why you took on the gray lady, the New York Times.
Thank you. Yeah.
What led you to do that?
I think it was just a really deep feeling that something is wrong. Something is wrong with the newspaper, and something's wrong with the notion that we all put our faith in this institution blindly. We assume that if it comes from the New York Times, therefore it's credible. But what I started to see in the world, and partly from being in Israel in the late part of the Intifada in 2002 or 3, was that just wasn't true. The reality and the reporting didn't match. And that sort of got inside me, and I wanted to understand it.
You know, what's so interesting about your book is I think people, especially around me, keep saying, oh, once upon a time, you could trust the news, right? Once upon a time, you could pick up the New York Times or turn on CNN and get unbiased news. And that's actually not true. It turns out when you study actually history and you actually dive into your book, you realize that even my parents should not have actually trusted the New York Times. And we're going to get into all of those examples, but just fast forward to what is happening today as we speak. We have Tucker Carlson being fired from Fox. We have Don Lemon being fired from CNN. Mm-hmm. Like, what is going on?
Yeah, it's the media is in this state of crisis. I think there's an economic crisis that they're dealing with. And they are dealing also with something that they call the trust crisis. But the trust crisis, when they use that terminology, puts the burden on us. We don't trust them enough. The reality is it's a reliability crisis. They are no longer reliable. And the public understands that. And that's on both sides of the aisle. We sort of understand now that there are agendas at work, that there are narratives that are being constructed to suit the needs of those agendas. And they are scrambling. They don't know what to do. Because for basically the last 80, 100 years, they've enjoyed the privilege of our trust, and they no longer have it.
One of the things, as I think about what has just happened recently with, the firing from legacy media, and I read your book at the same time, I think about this idea that if they were actually capitalist, if these news organizations were less of these ideologues and actually were more focused on building a business, then they would satisfy a larger customer base, right? Like if I ran CNN, I would call Tucker Carlson right now and I would say, hey, come over and let me get your audience. And then my audience would grow even further. And if CNN actually did that, not only would they probably make more money because they would have a larger audience, but they would actually do a favor to Americans because they would provide two perspectives so that Americans can actually go ahead and make their own decisions. But they're not capitalists, they're ideologues. And they've always been ideologues. And the New York Times has always been about ideology, not necessarily about managing a good business. Do you see that connection too?
For sure. I mean, today with the media, especially with the economic headwinds that they're facing, and since Google has basically eaten all their ad revenue, this would be the moment to rethink how they approach their market and how they serve their customer and who the customer is. That's the other thing. I think for a lot of media today, the customer is the political establishment, and the actual customer, the audience, is just kind of a byproduct. It's just a means of serving that upstream customer that they're really ideologically aligned to. And it's, of course, about being part of this set of people who think alike and they want to prove their bona fides to each other. But the Times did have somewhat of a capitalist approach to things, and it led to some of their very disastrous decision-making. But what we've seen in the last 10, 15 years, and certainly that's accelerated in the last 5 years, is that they've thrown that out the window and they've taken a political approach, which is about serving the base. 3% of their readership that is willing to become subscribers. And that 3% is increasingly extreme in their views. They're younger and they're more woke and more millennial. And the Times is scampering after them to try to serve them. And what that means is that they're giving up the rest of the 97% of the audience who are thinking, what is going on here?
Why do you think they're doing that? I mean, if they know that they're actually catering towards a more extreme base, is it because they only believe that the base would actually pay a recurring fee and that's what they need to capitalize on?
Partly, yeah. The entire, let's say, newspaper-based news media has flipped the model from advertising-based, which is kind of democratic because every set of eyeballs is worth the same amount as every other set of eyeballs. But when they moved to subscription-based model, that meant that the people who are willing to pay not just a few months or a few years, but for 20 to 30 years, you got to get those real true believers, the fundamentalists. And that's exactly what happened. And the 1619 Project was quite expressly a response, a tactic for them to attract this new kind of subscriber that would really fire them up and say, I need this so much, I'm going to pay you every single month indefinitely.
Your book, The Gray Lady Winked, talks about how a family started the New York Times. You talk a little bit about their background and the kind of impact they have on the way America thinks about virtually everything, right? It's the paper of record. And there's this one family that has such a strong influence on even on our policies, our decision making. Let's go back to the first story that you talk about here, which is how the New York Times got the reporting on the Holocaust. Wrong is an understatement.
Yeah.
Who owned the New York Times? What's their background? And how did they cover the Holocaust?
Yeah, they're called the Sulzberger family today. They still control the paper. It's a public company, but they have a two-tier stock structure, and they have special stocks that gives them control of the paper that cannot be taken from them. They trace back to the founder of this dynasty, and it is a dynasty. This is one of the great American business dynasties that still exists today. We kind of think about the Rothschilds and the Vanderbilts, who are basically all gone. This one still remains. And by the way, it is a literal patriarchy. They passed that baton of the chairman of the paper and the publisher of the newspaper, chairman of the New York Times Company, from male heir to male heir to male heir for 120 years. There's not been someone who is not a white male, to speak in New York Times terminology, for over a century. So these are, they were started by Ox Sulzberger, who was a German Jewish immigrant to the United States. And after him, it was handed back with a brief stopover through his son-in-law to another son-in-law named Sulzberger. And Sulzberger was the guy who kind of really took the paper in this real drastic direction, including with the World War II stuff, where they were reporting on Nazi Germany in a way that was so favorable to the Nazis that they would just read New York Times reporting on German broadcasts without changing the reports or censoring them.
These are German Jews that owned the New York Times, and you're saying that they didn't report about the Holocaust? Why would they not report about the Holocaust? They're Jewish. What interest would they have to support the Nazis?
There's two separate issues there. One was the support of the Nazis was because they had a Nazi sympathizer running their Berlin bureau during World War II and a lead up to World War II. That guy his name is Guido Inderis. He was loved by Nazi brass because of the way he reported on Germany. And so he got really great access. He got access to the top people. He got great stories, got great scoops. And the Times knew this. They knew about his sympathies for the Nazis. But this is back to their capitalist bent. They didn't want to give up that access. They wanted to be number one. They wanted the Pulitzers, which they won for their pro-German reporting during World War II. They won 2 Pulitzers. The Holocaust stuff was about them not wanting to be seen as a Jewish newspaper, as Jewish-owned. Because this was America in the 1940s. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. They were afraid that it would jeopardize their position in the market. And for them, that was just not something they would sacrifice even for the truth. So they actually forbade the word Jew from appearing in reports, news reports, during that period. And in one instance, which was the liberation of Auschwitz, they did a big story. And the word Jew didn't appear in that story. And that was the extent to which they were willing to go to keep the paper sort of free of Jewish influence or the appearance of any kind of Jewish slant.
It was so important for them to feel like they can belong and fit in that they were actually willing to sell their own Jewish brethren who are out there in Germany being slaughtered.
That was the ideological part for them, which is that they kind of subscribed to this approach to the Jewish faith, which for them meant that there was no such thing as Jewish people as an ethnicity or a nation. There was just Jewish worship. Like, you would go to a church and I would go to a synagogue and we're just all the same. And for them, what was happening in Europe was just happening to Europeans, not to Jews per se. So that was an ideological commitment that they made, and that's something that they all believed in. And it was about not wanting to be seen as being different. And it was also about not wanting to lose their leading position in the market.
How did they write articles about the Holocaust without mentioning the Jews? What did they write about?
They just didn't write about the Holocaust. That was the easy solution that they took. Or if they did, it would be in incredibly small articles that were buried in the back pages. So in one case that I talked about in the book, they did a story about the murder of 700,000 Jews in Europe. And they gave that something like 3-4 inches of column space, and they buried it on page 5. And the same day's edition, with the front page had a story about one man in Iceland being killed. That was the way they did it. Say, sure, we're covering it, but without really covering it. 6 years, they did 6 front page stories about the Holocaust.
That's unbelievable. And you're saying they won 2 Pulitzer Prizes? Did they ever apologize or, come out with a statement saying we were wrong?
They did some sort of, like in the 70s, they did a retrospective look at their Holocaust coverage by
30 years later.
Yes, and it was just one article, but they never corrected the record for the pro-Nazi reporting. They've never actually spoken about that.
The other example you bring up in your book is what happened between Russia and the Ukraine, Holodomor.
Yeah.
I would imagine that a lot of the people listening don't know that much about Holodomor. I didn't either. So can you tell me a little bit what happened there and when was it?
Holodomor is the Ukraine famine. That is, a famine is it's not really the right way to describe it. It was a campaign of genocide created by Stalin to consolidate power and to sort of do what Stalin did, which is to express his wrath politically on vulnerable people, in this case, peasants in the Ukraine. He starved 5 to 7 million people to death in a period of 2 years. It was 1931, 1932. And for Ukrainian people today, that is for them what Jews think of as the Holocaust. It is that magnitude. It affects them. It affects their family lives today. They still think about it and feel it. But the New York Times decided not to cover it, not just to not cover it, but to deny it. So other reporters were saying, this is happening at the time. And the New York Times reporter, Walter Duranty, said, there is no famine. There is no such thing. And that's how they reported on it. And they won a Pulitzer for that reporting. They have been called upon to return that Pulitzer, to amend the record and to sort of repent journalistically, but they've refused to do that.
Why? I guess both why. Why did they refuse to do it? But then why did they report a lie?
It was really incumbent upon them to help this group of business people in New York City push for the United States to officially recognize the Soviet government. It had been 16 years by that point since the Soviet Revolution. The United States had not recognized the Soviets as the legitimate government of Russia. And what that meant is that this sort of syndicate of businesses based in New York was not able to access that market for import or for export. That was a huge market. It was 150 million plus people rapidly industrializing. It was an incredible opportunity, but you couldn't trade with that market anymore because there were no diplomatic relations. So the New York Times was actually pushing FDR when he was still governor, just months before he became president, to do that, to recognize the Soviets. And this was not something FDR could do if that same government had just murdered 5 million of its own people for no reason. So you just kind of easily, glibly whitewash the record in real time. And when it came time to do that recognition, he did it. And there was a gala event at the Waldorf Astoria in New York where the who's who of American politics and business were in attendance, all the banks, the railroads, etc. Only one man got a standing ovation that night, and that was Walter Duranty. It was the guy who covered up.
The guy who lied about the fact
Yes.
that Ukrainians were literally starving to death.
Yes. Because they all knew, everyone in that room knew that it would never have happened without Duranty's sacrifice, quote
His
unquote.
lies.
His lies.
And when it came out as a lie and they were expected to return the prize, why didn't they return the prize, given that they know it's a lie?
I think that's a great question. Ukrainian American community in America started to push really hard around the early 2000s to address this. And the Times went out and hired a consultant, they called him as a historian, to assess the situation. Big surprise, the guy came back, said, you should return the prize. And then they said no. They said that to do that would be kind of like airbrushing history, which is a bizarre explanation.
Isn't it the opposite of airbrushing history?
It's the opposite, yeah. So they had already airbrushed history, and this would be to correct the record. Why did they really do that? I think because they understand that to give back one prize would open up the can of worms to say, okay, well, what about the World War II stuff? And what about the stuff the reporting for weapons of mass destruction that got a Pulitzer? What about this or that or that or that? There is a lot to correct. I did a story about, I think it was at least 7 Pulitzers that I count that the New York Times won incorrectly or illegitimately that really should be given back. I mean, these are clear-cut cases. So they don't want to go down that road.
Well, I think there is a difference between news entities that have reported a mistake by accident versus news entities that actually know that they're lying about things. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really what we're talking about here is that they knew that the Holocaust was happening, but because they didn't want to be associated with the Jews, they didn't report on it. Right. They knew that Holodomor was happening between Russia and Ukraine, but because they wanted to make Russia happy, they lied about it. And on to the next one is what happened in Japan. So it's another example where they knew that they were reporting a lie, but they still went ahead and did that.
That was actually quite remarkable because this isn't like, maybe they did, maybe they did. They did actually work with the War Department. They sent their star science reporter, William Lawrence, and they sort of loaned him out to the War Department. In exchange, he got access to the bombing run that dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. So this was quid pro quo. He was expected to carry water for the War Department, and he actually was working with them to develop pamphlets, propaganda pamphlets about this new weapon to make it seem less horrendous than it was. And he was also expected to deny that there was radiation poisoning as a result of it. So you could sell it to the American people as just a really big bomb and not something that makes people sick for years on end after the fact. It was an arrangement that worked for both parties. The party that lost was the American people who didn't know the truth about what this bomb really did until months later, where, again, you have a very narrow period where you can set public opinion with what comes out first. And people just say, okay, this is the story. There's no radiation poisoning as a result of the bomb. And in fact, of course, there was. And other people were reporting it, including some of their own reporters, who they subsequently shut down in order to keep the propaganda line.
Is this an example where the government actually told the papers what to write?
They told them what to write, and they willingly said, sure, let's make the deal. And the deal was, you get your reporter to be with the armada that's dropping this bomb. You get to have the first story. You get to report from looking out the window as you're seeing the mushroom cloud rise into the air. And we get the New York Times to help us write the propaganda and to publish it in their paper.
It's unbelievable because, as I say, we keep thinking that before we were born, these news entities were reliable. But, these are obviously examples of things that have happened many, many years ago. It's just the public was unaware that we were being manipulated, I guess.
Yeah, we place a lot of store in the brands that have been built up for decades, if not centuries. And, the Times, I think, is actually, it is different in a way. I mean, I did a lot of comparison with the book, looking at what the Washington Post did, for example, when the New York Times was calling the Berlin Olympics in 1936, the Nazi Olympics, the greatest sporting event of all time. Yeah. The Washington Post was actually saying, this is a disaster. This is a propaganda win for the Nazis. So the Times is different in that way, but it's also symbolic of the rest of the media, which is why it's it's such a fascinating way to look at the media through this lens.
That is an interesting question, I guess, that you asked yourself, and I should have asked you too, which is, how did the other media outlets report on all these issues? But you're saying that really the New York Times had its own agenda.
Yeah, in most of these cases, that was the case. I mean, the Post was pretty good on the Nazi stuff. They were not reporting like the Times was. On the atomic bomb, the radiation poisoning, there were plenty of other reporters who were on the ground saying there's absolutely radiation poisoning going on here. The same would be with the Holocaust, of course. Lots of reporting by other papers. People ask me, how does it get this reputation for being number one if all this is going on? My answer is that its reputation for being number one is because of all this stuff. Because they were working with the Nazis to get the best scoops. Because they were working with the War Department to get their reporter on the plane looking out the window at the mushroom cloud. They were willing to sacrifice everything, first of all, the truth, in order to stay number one.
What about Iraq? That's another example that you bring up, I guess, somewhat more recent, something that some of us can still remember.
Yeah, Iraq, I think it fits that pattern. They really came out looking for prizes. They had a new editor at the time named Howell Raines, who really wanted to make the New York Times, which was, a very well-known but still mostly focused on New York paper, into this national phenomenon in news, more like CBS or ABC than just a newspaper tied to a city. So he said, we're going to increase what he called the competitive metabolism of the New York Times. We are going to be number one. We're going to beat the Washington Post for Pulitzers. And we are going to do that by getting rid of all our kind of blue Dem hangups, and we're going to go after the red meat for the story. And the red meat for this story was Saddam Hussein has WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. That wasn't true, of course, but they were so invested in that narrative, and they were so invested in securing the Pulitzer, which they won, that they blinded themselves. And Judith Miller, of course, played a role in that, where she was reporting stuff that it didn't make the cut. It didn't meet their own standards for, when you've got the story of the decade, and your source is a guy standing 100 feet away from you wearing a baseball cap saying, this is where the weapons were, pointing at the ground, and you can't interview him, and you don't know his name, and you don't know who he is, but you run that story anyway. There's a problem, and it's not just about Judy Miller, it's about the paper that was allowing that kind of reporting to hit its front pages.
I mean, a lot of it comes from leadership, but certainly they ended up throwing Judith Miller under the bus.
Yeah, they made this huge hue and cry about protecting their reporters and protecting the sources. This was after she reported on the identity of a CIA agent that was leaked by someone in the administration. She went to jail for that. She stood behind her principles and her convictions, and she actually sat in jail. And the New York Times, the Sulzberger, that Sulzberger at the time, and there's a different Sulzberger now.
There's always a Sulzberger.
There's always a Sulzberger, and his name is always Arthur. And so that Arthur Sulzberger, he came out and went on Charlie Rose saying, we stand behind Judy and what she's doing, and it's terrible conditions. Meanwhile, she's saying the conditions are actually okay. But she gets out of jail, and then 2-3 days later, or maybe a week later, they fire her. And that was that, because it was no longer good for the brand.
What I remember hearing about the stories from Iraq were all these veterans that were suffering from PTSD and just coming back to America and beating their wives and killing people. I just, the way veterans were treated, to me, this was the first time that we started seeing Americans really bash veterans in a way that was really disruptive to our psyche.
Yeah. The next chapter after WMD in my book is that the Times came out with this homicidal veterans narrative. And it was really being advanced by a young reporter named Jason Blair, who was a rising star at the paper, very young. He'd had a few red flags associated with him for a lot of errors that kind of didn't make a lot of sense. But he was bringing home the goods. And the goods in this case were that these veterans were coming home broken and crazed and whatever that fits
violent,
violent.
Right?
Yeah. Turns out he was making up most of those stories. He was fabricating them out of thin air. And if you kind of looked at his
How do you know
reporting,
that? How do you know he was making it up? Is it already?
Oh, that was exposed.
It's exposed already.
Yeah. He was fired. He was, if you just looked at the timeline of his reporting, it was physically impossible, for him to have been in the places he said to have been interviewing these sources. And when the Times actually went and re-interviewed them, they said, I never talked to this guy. I don't know who he is. But what he was saying, using these people who had, some of them lost loved ones in the war, was that the son or the daughter, whoever it was broken, was regretful, remorseful, or angry about it. And they would go and interview these people, and the actual person, if the person was still alive, would say, no, I'm proud of my service. It was hard. I don't regret it. Maybe it was an amputee, or maybe they were injured, but they say, I feel okay about what happened. But the homicidal veterans thing was just a lie. They just made it up. There was no statistics to support it. In fact, if you looked at the actual numbers, veterans coming back from Iraq were less likely to commit acts of violence than the general population.
Wow. So why did they push this narrative that these veterans came back violent?
Because they had just supported the Bush administration with the WMD stuff. And when their readership looked at them and be like, what happened? You just supported the most evil guy on earth, which is how the media made Bush look at the time.
Right.
They had to atone for that. And they did it by now saying this was the most evil war that had ever
shift
been.
the narrative.
Yeah.
Shift the narrative where they would look like
Back to the base.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounded from some of your interviews and your writings that you got into this business of exposing the Gray Lady or the New York Times through something that is very similar to my personal experience, which is the reporting on Israel.
Yeah.
And so tell me a little bit about that. How did you get to realize that even the New York Times, owned by Jews, is lying about Israel?
I got to Israel, it was like the very tail end of the Intifada. There were still bombings here and there, but it wasn't like it was in 2000, 2001. And you just read what the Times says about the country, and not even the war that the Intifada was, but just what daily life is like between Jews and Arabs. Right. That's what really struck me, and it still strikes me today after I lived there for 20 years now. It is more or less a place where coexistence is real. It's part of our daily lives, and it is not this ongoing enmity between Jews and Arabs, and there's not this ongoing persecution of Arabs by Jews. That's just not what life is like there, and you can feel that. And when you read the reporting, and the New York Times is putting dead Palestinian children on the front page, photos of them in a montage, and they've not done that for any other war in the history of the New York Times newspaper, you think that something is going on here. And then you look at their reporting on the Holocaust, on World War II, on any other number of things, and you think, okay, well, I think I understand what's going on here. That was part of it.
So do you think the same reason that they did not produce any articles about the Holocaust or any significant articles about the murders of Jews in the Holocaust is a similar reason why they were so focused on bashing Israel and lying about Israel?
Yeah.
It's the same kind of ideology.
Yes.
Of
Definitely.
Just distancing themselves and not looking like they're part of, the Jewish group or something like that.
Yeah.
It's almost like reverse anti-Semitism, or it's actually anti-Semitism done by Jews.
Yeah, because for them, they don't see Jews as a people or as a nation or even as an ethnicity. So why should they have a state, right? You got America, it's fine. But they've been anti-Israel in that way, politically anti-Israel since Israel's birth. And this was just a way for them to drive home that message. And it sort of optimizes over time. It gets more and more intense as the ideology kind of compounds within the newspaper. Because again, this is a dynasty. They hand down not just control and ownership, but ideological commitments. And you get to the point where it's both ideological and, from a business perspective, benefits them to pander to that base that feels the same way.
I mentioned that a similar story happened to me, where I'm an American. I was born here in the United States, and I lived in Israel for several years.
Yeah.
And when I came back from Israel and I saw the lies about Israel, there were two things that really got me into the business of trying to share truth with the public. And one of them was education. the teachers' unions and the lies that are being taught to American kids, the lowering of standards, and all of that really ties into the great big American lie, and that is that the teachers' unions actually care about kids or teachers. They don't care about anybody except for their own power and money. And the other great lie that woke me up was the lie about Israel, right? Where, places like New York Times would report that Israel is an apartheid state. And I came back from Israel as an American. I'm like, wait a second, I lived there. There is no apartheid state. I mean, in high school, we would have friends that spoke Arabic. It's why I can kind of get away with a few Arabic words. And so this great big lie that Israel is oppressing, a minority Arab population, and the fact that the New York Times is propagating that is just mind-boggling.
For me, if that's their point of view, that's okay. Everyone's entitled to it. The problem is that when you actually start to change facts, change the ground truth in order to support the narrative, and that's the 1619 Project is another great example of that. If that's your point of view in America, I don't agree with it. It's not how I think. That's all right. But when you're distorting and perverting the historical record to achieve it, that's actually a very different story. That's where things become really dangerous. And that's what happens with Israel. With Mohammed al-Dura was the young boy who was killed under unknown circumstances in the beginning of the Intifada. And the New York Times came out within days of that happening saying Israel murdered a child.
That was in the Intifada, was that 2001?
This was in 2000. Things broke out. Yeah. And I think his death was in 2000. The New York Times wasn't there. They didn't have a reporter. What was the
exact story? Remind me. I should remember.
The story was that the Intifada breaks out, and under a very kind of weird set of circumstances, this is like mass violence in the territories. His father wants to go out and buy a used car or something, so that day decides they get stuck at a checkpoint where there's a gun battle between Palestinian terror factions and an IDF post. And this video emerges of this little boy with his father sheltering behind a concrete barrier, and the boy seems to be hit by a bullet and dies, or is said to have died. I mean, people question that. I don't know. But the narrative that came out of that is that the IDF killed the boy. And the New York Times reported that, and not just reported it, they hammered it home in op-eds, in mentions in other articles. It became gospel. Years later, there was a court in France that had to do with libel because a French Jew in France accused a French news channel of sort of manufacturing this as a hoax. The French company sued him, and the French court ruled in the favor of the Jew who said this was not true. The forensic expert in France said there was no possible way, given the positions of the IDF and the child, that the IDF could have killed the boy. It was not physically possible. And the New York Times, of course, didn't respond to that, didn't report that, after they had manufactured this myth about essentially a blood libel, that in cold blood, they had shot this boy.
Who shot the boy then? Did we ever find out
how he was killed?
No, it was Why was there a boy running around?
None of it really makes sense.
Fire.
It's not been resolved. But what is clear is that it was not Israeli soldiers. And what is clear on the media side is that Israel was blamed for that occurrence.
Did the New York Times ever publish a correction or an apology?
Never.
No.
And that was the myth that in part was used to justify the murder of Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was killed by Al-Qaeda. They said, look what you are doing to our children. Your own media is documenting this, and we are taking our revenge.
Do you happen to know how the New York Times reported on Daniel Pearl?
No, not really. I would imagine,
lukewarm?
I imagine. I never really looked into that. No.
Yeah. So onto a more recent issue, and that is critical race theory and the 1619 Project, which I would hope is considered a massive failure. But what is scary about it is that they've been successful at not just being a news media company, but now an educational company, right? The 1619 Project had the goal of actually being in schools and essentially brainwashing the American student public, right?
And now it is.
And now it is.
Yeah.
So what are the origins of the 1619 Project?
The 1619 Project came from a reporter, New York Times reporter named Nicole Hannah-Jones, who had reported quite a lot on race, a lot about what she describes as segregation in the education system, that Black kids go to school with mostly Black kids and white kids go to school with mostly white kids. If that's true or not, I don't know, but that was her approach. So she came up with this idea, which was really born out of the critical race theory movement that had its roots in the 1970s in academia at Harvard and other places. And that was taking the argument to its absolute extreme, which is to say that America was not born in liberty, but born in slavery, born out of slavery. And that was the 1619 number, which is the year that slaves arrived in the colonies. So it wasn't 1776 where America achieved or declared independence, but 1619, that is the true birth of the nation. And they made this into the biggest possible editorial initiative that they could make, which is a full issue of the New York Times Magazine dedicated to that concept. And then sort of, as you're kind of referencing, growing it out into this brand extension thing that includes educational curricula and colleges and podcasts and a show with Oprah and movies and children's books, you name it, they did it. And in that regard, it's been very successful. And sort of as I'd mentioned earlier, it was really a centerpiece of their marketing mix. It was really a way for them to appeal to a younger, more woke generation that they were really eager to get hold of as new subscribers.
So you think it was part of this whole woke industrial complex where they realized that if they push this narrative of critical race theory, is critical race theory part of the 1619 Project?
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
And can you explain critical race theory and how it's connected to what they're trying to teach through this project?
Yeah, sure. It's really about taking the fundamentals of critical theory, which was a philosophical movement from the early 20th century, which said that truth is not an objective thing. Truth is whatever the victims of power say it is. So who decides, well, who are the victims of power? Well, we do, the people who are talking. And that really was a huge reorientation from this like classical Enlightenment notion of truth, which is something that we all kind of do our best to approximate together, and saying, no, this is about what I declare to be the truth, that truth is about power. It's not about knowledge. And they took this and sort of applied it to race and said, if you look at this racial hierarchy of racial victimhood, that the people with the most truth are the most victimized. And they sort of use that to manufacture the world we see today, which is that you've got what people describe as the victimhood Olympics.
Yeah, victim bingo. I call it victim bingo.
Yeah. That's what 1619 is about. It's about saying, no, it's not about objective historical truth. Because when the project came out, you had historians, dozens of historians from prestigious universities, not right-wing people, coming out and saying, actually, this is not true. What you're saying is not true. Their own fact checker told them that you cannot say the Revolutionary War was fought to preserve slavery. That's not true. That was a professor of African-American studies, an African-American woman at Northwest University, said this is not true. But for them, with critical race theory behind them, it wasn't about what was objectively true or false. There was no such thing. It's about what serves the needs of power and who deserves to have that power. And for them, it was about this group of sort of radical people thinking about how to restructure power in America. And the New York Times.
So what did they do? They just ignored the historians that said it was wrong? It's just like, okay, never mind. We don't like what you have to say. Keep going with 1619?
Yes. Yeah, they just ignored them. They just ignored their fact checker, a woman named Leslie Harris, professor, who she came out in Politico and wrote an article about this, saying they published the claim anyway. Mm-hmm. And that was the key word, anyway, because it wasn't about historical truth and it wasn't about objectivity. And this was something that flipped in the Trump era. And they came out and started saying this in around 2018, 2019, where they said objectivity is no longer the goal of journalism. The goal of journalism was what they called moral clarity. It was about taking a position, taking a activist approach to journalism and really pursuing that angle.
I mean, the hypocrisy is so unbelievable because they were so obsessed with Donald Trump
Yeah.
and claiming that he was lying and that they were all focused on the truth. Meanwhile, they've been lying to us for years. But not only have they been lying to us for years, they actually have an entire 1619 program that admittedly is not about the truth. How do they get away with that? How are they the paper of record? It's just bonkers.
And I think that's what comes back to the whole through line of the book is that they are willing to stay number one at all costs, including the cost of truth. And the 1619 Project is just a great example of that because you fire up all these people. You say something so extreme and so out there that it's going to be challenged across the board. It does make things a little bit more binary. We like it or we love it or we hate it, but that's okay for them. Division is okay for them. Division works great in media because you want that kind of energy, you want that kind of tension, and they achieved it with the 1619 Project.
It's just so crazy. The other hypocrisy is that they keep putting America through the purity test.
Yeah.
America was not founded by completely perfect individuals, and therefore America is this horrible place, right? That's the narrative that the 1619 Project pushes, but they don't apply that to their own background, right? And their own history.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, why has there never been a non-white male publisher of the New York Times ever? I mean, they didn't even consider a different option. It's not even in the running. And I think that's what it is for them. It's like they can do what they need to do to support the dynasty. One thing that they've been really hardline about in the business of the New York Times company is being anti-union. They really try to crush the union movement within the paper. And that's been something that's come up recently, where there's this tech guild that some of the tech staff and reporters are trying to form. And the New York Times is brutal when it comes to their own employees trying to unionize. When it comes to other companies and unions, they are gung-ho. So this is just another facet of that.
Are they starting to suffer from their own poison?
It's not something I ever really thought would happen, but I think there's so much awareness today, and I think there's so much focus on the New York Times from every angle about what's going wrong and what's happening there. The pressure of it and the cost of it, all the lawsuits that they're defending, it has to actually take a toll on the business. And they recently had another shift in their editorial leadership from Dean Baquet to Joseph Kahn, who I think is probably, they had this recent uprising about trans issues at the paper where trans advocates and activists came out saying the New York Times is not covering this correctly. And rather than cave, they pushed back really hard. Rather than do the sort of town hall thing that they love to do, they said, absolutely not. And if you get up and walk out and protest, you're going to get fired. And that's a big shift for the Times.
What are the chances that one of the Sulzbergers will actually step down and give the winner of victim bingo their position?
0.
It's like one has to ask that, right? One has to wonder.
Never going to happen.
Are there, I guess, nefarious or outside influencers on these media companies, whether it's New York Times or CNN or, all these folks that are pushing things that are so bad, they're so obviously bad for America that one has to wonder, where is this funding coming from? People ask me all the time, is George Soros behind this? Or, George Soros is known as like the one big villain behind a lot of this kind of push for America to become more socialist. But is it China? I mean, we know that, there is a huge impact of China on the way America thinks now.
Yeah.
Have you done any research on that since publishing your book?
Yeah, Soros, I don't know what the relationship with the Times, but China for sure. I mean, China, the Times actually has a Chinese edition of the newspaper. It's one of the few language editions dedicated to a single country. I think it's the only one actually. And for them, it's the future. I mean, you've got 1.4 billion people, 1.6 or whatever billion people in that market, and accessing that market is for them
massive.
Yeah, it's massive. It's where the growth is. They know that growth in the U.S. is going to be limited to what it currently is. So for them, it's all about getting access to that market. But they also know that they are bumping up against the Great Firewall, which means that if they say the wrong thing, which they did when they first launched their Chinese edition.
With the CCP?
Yeah, they did some reporting on very senior CCP figures and corruption, and they just got banned from China from that day on. And now they're trying to fight to get back in. And that means you can't go too far in what you report on China. You can't stray from the party line. Otherwise, you're not going to ever access that market, and your competitors will. And you can see that today, and it's an echo of the Holocaust coverage that they didn't do, which is the Uyghur coverage. There is a genocide taking place in China against an ethnic, religious minority. And ask yourself, when was the last time you saw front page coverage about the Uyghurs in the New York Times or any other newspaper? They just don't do it. They don't talk about it. We don't know anything about it. And of course, the New York Times, like many other American news organizations, has until fairly recently taken money from Chinese propaganda, from China Daily. It was paying out huge sums of money to advertise. And these advertisements were actually advertorials. They look like editorial. You'd open the New York Times print edition, you would see great coverage about China and CCP. And if you didn't happen to see the little advertorial label at the top right of the paper, you wouldn't know that it was paid for by the Chinese Communist Party.
So you think that the New York Times, just like they played friendly with the Nazis during the Holocaust, they're playing friendly with the CCP now?
For sure. Just like any huge tech company would do and does, it's the same calculus.
COVID.
Yeah.
Do you think that's related? You think the way the New York Times did not report about the Wuhan leak, in fact, pressured people and mocked people who spoke about the truth about the leak of the lab. Is that connected? Is that part of them wanting to play friendly with China?
Probably. I think when they came out on February 17th, 2020, it was a month before a pandemic was declared, saying that if you think this came from a lab in China, that you're a conspiracy theorist. There was no scientific publication at that point saying anything like that. There was only one thing that said that, and that was an article, an editorial in China Daily saying the very same thing using the same exact language 1 week prior. 1 week later, the New York Times comes out saying the same stuff about the lab leak being a racist conspiracy theory. And that was a line that they held for quite a long time. And it had nothing to do with Donald Trump. Donald Trump was praising China in February and March of 2020. He was saying she is doing a great job. And it was only in April that he came out talking about lab leak. The New York Times had been on this anti-lab leak crusade for, by that point, 2 months. So they set the tone. Absolutely.
Why do you think the New York Times was on this anti-lab leak crusade?
I think it was in part because they were paying attention to the Chinese messaging. And I think the overwhelming influence with that was Anthony Fauci. Donald McNeil was their top COVID reporter at the time. He was actually writing to Fauci saying, "You're doing such a great job. That press conference you did was amazing. I got a bobblehead of you." I actually bought two.
These are New York Times contributors that are celebrating Fauci and giving him kudos?
Absolutely. And it went both ways. And Fauci would write back saying, "Thanks, Donald, you're great too. And I love what you did in that article. It was amazing." And that was the relationship. And that was because Fauci holds enormous amount of power. And if you're a science reporter, you're dependent on access to Fauci to do a really good job in that vertical. And they all knew it, and they all loved him, and they all looked at him as this god. And when he handed down the messaging about lab leak, they just ran with it. There's no other reliable explanation for why they would call lab leak a conspiracy theory in mid-February 2020.
So it was because they wanted to make him happy so that he continues to give them access to information? Or it's just this whole
they've just
cycle?
Believed what he said. And he says this came from an animal. This was animal spillover. And we're seeing a lot of conspiracy theory about people talking about the lab in Wuhan. And that's all it is. And that's the story that they run.
In your opinion, did Fauci know more about it? And he
For sure.
wanted to just not share that with the public? I mean, was he do you think that Dr. Fauci was lying to the New York Times and then the New York Times was sharing his lies because they believed what he said?
He may not have known exactly what happened at that point. I'm sure he knows now, but he did know what kind of stuff they were doing in that lab. He funded it. Mm-hmm. And what really set him off in this sort of panic in late January was discovering a Science magazine article saying that one way that COVID could have emerged is in this kind of study. And it referenced a 2015 study done in the Wuhan lab. And Fauci says to his deputy, "Go find out if we funded this study." They did fund that study. And the deputy came back and told him that. The next day, Fauci said, "We need to do this emergency conference call with some of the top scientists in the field to kind of start coordinating the messaging. And that's exactly what happened.
Why do you think he lied?
Because this is the worst pandemic in a generation, or many generations, and he might be culpable for starting it. The kind of research, you can call it research, I would say in air quotes, that they're doing is to take exactly like what kind of virus this is, bring it into a lab and give it what they call pandemic potential. That's the research. Can you take a non-harmful virus, put it in a lab, and make it a pathogen of pandemic potential, PPP? That's exactly what they've been doing for 10 plus years. And he is the primary funder of that research.
Have you heard of NewsGuard?
Yeah, I have.
So NewsGuard has had an impact on us in a really bad way. Dennis would speak about things related to the lockdowns and COVID. We would receive these threatening emails from this organization called NewsGuard saying, you are propagating misinformation and we're going to let the public know that, basically you're fake news. First of all, I was like, what fake news? I mean, every person we bring on has, credibility and it's legitimate sources. And unlike the New York Times, we're not looking to play friendly with, certain interest groups, but we would receive all this pressure from NewsGuard to not report on things. And at first we were like, well, who cares what you even have to say, NewsGuard? If you slap us with a bad label, supposedly you think that what we're saying is not true, we shouldn't have to worry about that. But because they have all of these connections with other entities, they essentially apply pressure on other organizations and companies not to work with PragerU. And so actually NewsGuard became an issue not when they sent us these threatening emails, but when they actually informed other companies not to work with PragerU. And so we received an email from JW Player, our video servicing company, telling us that we have a month or so to take off all our videos and find a new entity that's going to serve our videos. And when we asked them why, their answer was, well, NewsGuard gave you a bad rating, and God forbid they would work with a company that gets a bad rating from NewsGuard. And I do foresee that this is what's going to happen with other entities and other, businesses that won't work with companies that are simply afraid of the NewsGuard rating, right? They don't want to deal with it, or they actually believe it. And that will ultimately lead to what I call economic suffocation, right? They're trying to suffocate us from working with any other groups. Eventually, they're going to go also into financial institutions that shouldn't work with entities that propagate misinformation, according to NewsGuard. And I'm just curious what kind of experience you have with these, entities that guard the news. Clearly, there is some stuff that is happening behind the scenes where they put pressure on companies, media companies, to not share information that, whether it's the government or big interest groups, don't want to have shared.
Yeah, NewsGuard, from what I know, which is not that much, but what it seems to me is that they are sort of this seal of approval of what is correct information, right think, and what is wrong think. And if it comes out of this, let's say 20 to 30 news organizations that are approved by them, then it's automatically good and okay for consumption. But I think the actual danger is on the other side, where they're just rubber stamping, they're giving a seal of approval to information that may not be reliable at all. So if you're the New York Times, the Washington Post, the notion that you've got this glaze of credibility, of trustworthiness, but we all know that that's actually not true. And the American public knows that's not true. When you look at the trust in media numbers, it is a steep decline. And I think what this is a way to push back on that. It's a way to sort of create this ring of enforcement that just said, we're going to ram this through. We're going to make sure our guys get the right kind of treatment and service and the other guys don't get it. It's not even about red and blue anymore. Right. It's about, are you aligned or are you not aligned?
Right. I completely agree. You talk about the New York Times as a dynasty. I think of NewsGuard as the guardians of this dynasty, right? They're guarding.
Praetorian Guard.
Right?
Yeah.
That's exactly what they are. Yeah. Of course, New York Times gets 100% rating, and you have a book full of information about how not only do they keep getting it wrong, but they never apologize or print a correction. You know, you got the New York Times with 100% rating and PragerU receiving this, red label warning everybody that we're the ones who are telling lies. And I completely agree. It's not a left versus right. It really is about who they can control and which narrative they can control and whose narrative they cannot control.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's sort of also what we're seeing with the current banking crisis. You know, if you don't get in line and say, oh, the financial system is okay and the banks are completely solvent, then you are cast out as some sort of lunatic or outlier, even though it's clearly the case that something is very wrong with America's financial system. But you can't say that out loud, because if you say it out loud, you threaten to rock the boat. We can all see with our eyes what's happening, but you can't say that out loud.
It's like 1984.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I ask you the hardest question?
Sure.
Where can someone get honest news? What would you do? I mean, where can we actually go for trustworthy news?
I think it's really about rethinking the way we interact with the news. And just like we rethought the way we interact with music, where it was no longer about the album. We used to go out and buy an album, and then you would say, oh, this is going to be a great album. And we used to do the same thing with the newspaper. I'm going to go out and buy the newspaper and be like, everything in here is going to be more or less good enough. We can no longer do that. And now we have Spotify and say, I want this song and that song and make a playlist. And it's the same thing with news. Say, all right, this report at the New York Times is really good. And this one at Fox News or Washington Post or wherever you might find it is good. It's no longer enough to just trust the brand, which is what we used to do. We used to use that as a kind of heuristic to say, this is good. You can't do that anymore. You have to say, I trust myself. I trust people around me who I know. And I'm going to do my own research to understand what I can rely upon and cherry pick.
It's so interesting because I actually think this is happening from both directions, right? A lot of newsmakers are realizing that they don't want to be part of a larger entity where they can, Barry Weiss left the New York Times. Who knows what's going to happen with Tucker?
Yeah.
But you have like Tim Pool and all these other folks that are actually coming out of these media establishments and very likely are going to build their own audience base that's going to follow them directly. And you were self-published, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess you're another example of how being part of these established entities is actually coming across now less trustworthy.
Yeah. And also the economics are better. I get to retain all my rights. When you sell a book to a publisher, you give away your rights in perpetuity, universal rights around the world forever. If you don't want to do that, you can now do something different. And it's the same with news, where Barry or Andrew Sullivan or Glenn Greenwald, they are the masters of their own fate editorially. And to your point about Tucker, I saw a clip, I think Dave Rubin posted of him and Dave talking. Dave said, are you jealous of Dave being independent? And Tucker said, of course I am, because that's the most important thing. So I think the move towards independence, wherever you are politically, it doesn't matter. It's about being independent. It's not about being enchained to some huge organization. Today, 90% of the media is in the hands of 6 companies. And those companies are gigantic companies. That's Comcast, that's AT&T, Verizon, NBC Universal. These are giant companies that have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, not to their news audiences.
Not to the truth.
And least of all to the truth. So they're doing what's good for the stock price or what's good for their ideological commitments. And I think the truth comes last.
Yeah, it's no surprise that they hire folks like NewsGuard and other fact checkers to try to take any sort of incoming competition down.
It's a very clever model, the NewsGuard model.
Yeah.
It's one I deeply disagree with. I think this is not what we need right now. What we need to understand is how reliable is the reporting. That is the question we're all seeking to understand. NewsGuard doesn't answer that. NewsGuard deflects that.
Right.
And that's why it serves such a great purpose, a great need for the media, because that's what they're looking to do, is deflect.
Well, I really, really enjoyed reading your book.
Thank you so much.
It took me the whole weekend, but it was totally worth it. And I actually really highly recommend it because, there are a lot of claims we made here in this conversation, and the book actually backs it up with a lot of evidence. And so it was a fascinating read. I hope people will go ahead and buy it and get more informed. And thanks for all you're doing. And thanks for being so courageous to speak out. And I look forward to speaking with you again.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. This has been great.